They say history repeats itself, but no one ever imagined it would look like this. For 77 years, Gaza was the face of suffering, of shattered walls and silenced cries. But now, something has shifted. The images that once came out of Gaza are now coming from Tel Aviv. The fear that once gripped Palestinian children now haunts Israeli streets. One Iranian strike turned the world upside down, and in doing so exposed everything the media tried to hide, every double standard, every lie, every illusion of superiority. This isn't just about war. It's about awakening. It's about a moment when the oppressed stopped whispering and started echoing across the sky. What you're about to hear isn't just a speech. It's a truth the world has been too afraid to admit. So sit down, breathe, and listen closely. Because by the time this ends, you won't see the world the same way again. 77 years ago, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the world witnessed the birth of a nation born from the ashes of a people who had suffered deeply. Jews who had faced unimaginable horrors in Europe. The Holocaust had scarred history forever, and with global sympathy, the State of Israel was established in 1948. It was portrayed as a safe haven, a land where never again would its people live in fear. Survivors arrived, displaced and broken, clutching hope like a fragile lifeline. They were promised security, justice, and a future where pain would be behind them. The world nodded in agreement, carrying a collective guilt. But as years passed, the narrative took a different shape. The land chosen for their refuge wasn't empty. It was already home to a people with centuries of connection to the soil. Palestinians. What followed wasn't a peaceful coexistence. It became a story of dispossession, forced evictions, refugee camps, walls, and checkpoints. Gaza became a symbol of confinement, resistance, and repeated devastation. Fast forward through decades of conflict, settlements, wars, and a siege that turned Gaza into what some described as the world's largest open-air prison. And something tragic happened. The oppressed had become the oppressors. The very cries that once echoed in Europe now found eerie reflections in the cries of children in Gaza under the roar of fighter jets and collapsing buildings. The symmetry of suffering was undeniable, but the world looked away. For years, Israel bombed Gaza with near impunity, claiming defense, and Gaza bled, year after year, with rubble instead of ruse, funerals instead of festivals. All the while, Israel was painted as the beacon of democracy in the Middle East. Its pain was recognized, its fear was justified, but the same courtesy was not extended to the people of Gaza. And then, the unexpected happened. One night, one retaliatory strike, one show of strength that changed everything. Iran's massive retaliation not only shook the land, it shook the narrative. For the first time in decades, Israel looked like Gaza. Sirens in Tel Aviv, smoke rising from military installations. Fear in the eyes of those who had never imagined this on their soil. It was more than missiles. It was a mirror, a reflection, a flashback. The imagery that once belonged only to Gaza was now seen in Israel. Collapsed buildings, chaos, and uncertainty. The irony wasn't just poetic. It was historical. Because in that moment, 77 years of history folded in on itself. The oppressed had been heard, and the walls that separated suffering from privilege began to blur. It wasn't a celebration of violence. It was a moment of realization that power, when unchecked, always comes full circle. That suffering, when ignored, demands to be seen, and that no nation, no matter how strong, can build peace on the silence of the oppressed. Gaza has become a symbol of survival, not because life flourishes there, but because death is so common, and yet the people refuse to die inside. For years, Gaza has cried out while the world watched with muted sympathy or complete silence. But something happened recently that the world didn't expect. For the first time, the suffering that was always contained within Gaza's borders seemed to escape. When Iran launched its massive retaliatory strike on Israel, a curtain lifted. The sirens in Tel Aviv screamed. The explosions in the sky above Haifa looked hauntingly familiar. The images that the world had grown used to seeing from Gaza, smoke trails, destroyed buildings, people running for cover, were now coming from inside Israel. And that changed everything. Certainly, Israel wasn't just the force behind the bombs. It was now on the receiving end. The psychological shift was massive. For years, Israelis had viewed themselves as distant from the kind of terror Gazans faced daily. Now, for a moment, they were pulled into that same world. The fear, the unpredictability, the powerlessness. This wasn't about celebrating destruction. It was about something deeper. About empathy being forced through lived experience. For decades, Gaza's cries fell on deaf ears. But when Israel began to look like Gaza, some of those ears began to listen. The illusion of separation cracked. The idea that suffering was always going to be someone else's problem no longer held. The pictures looked too similar. The sirens sounded too familiar. People who had once dismissed Gaza's trauma were now asking, is this what they feel like every day? And for the first time, there was a brief glimpse into the mirror, a reflection of what occupation, siege, and war feel like on the other side. The shift was not just military, it was human. For decades, Israel had existed in a position of dominance. Its streets rarely touched, its citizens shielded by powerful defense systems and foreign support. But now, even that sense of immunity had cracks. And in those cracks, the truth began to leak. The truth that Gaza is not just a statistic, that its pain is real, and that no amount of power can protect anyone forever from the weight of injustice. The military response was only part of the impact. The deeper effect was in perception. Millions around the world who had only seen Gaza's skies on fire now saw Israeli cities looking just as vulnerable. The power balance in the region had visibly shifted, and with it, so had the narrative. When Gaza is bombed, the world barely flinches. But when the tables turned, when Israel was hit in a way it hadn't been before, the tone shifted overnight. Suddenly, the language in the media changed. The same outlets that were numb to Gaza's pain found renewed vocabulary for grief. Headlines screamed about Israeli suffering. Leaders around the world condemned the strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa as acts of terror. There were emergency meetings, calls for support, vows of solidarity. The world that stayed silent for Gaza cried out for Israel. Why is resistance from a colonized people branded as terrorism, while military operations from a nuclear-armed state are called self-defense? Why is there mourning for one side and justification for the other? Why does one strike from Iran provoke global outrage, while years of devastation in Gaza provoke nothing but tired excuses? The hypocrisy was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, undeniable, and shameful. The Iranian strike, for all its destruction, forced a mirror onto the face of the world, and what stared back was uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about politics. It was about humanity, about who we choose to see, who we choose to hear, and who we choose to ignore. The psychological impact of this moment rippled across the region. It showed that arrogance built on decades of unchecked power can crumble in a matter of hours. The strike was not just a message to Israel's defenses, but to its pride. The collapse of that superiority complex marks the beginning of a new reality, one where power is tested, not assumed, and where the oppressed are no longer the only ones who feel fear. There comes a point in history when events rise above politics, above military calculations, above territorial disputes, and instead speak directly to the soul of humanity. The Iranian strike was not just a geopolitical reaction. It carried a spiritual undertone that resonated far deeper than the sound of exploding warheads. This moment didn't just strike Israel. It struck the world's conscience. It asked humanity to remember that there is always a judge above all judges, a plan above all plans. And when the oppressed have nothing left but faith, sometimes that is all they need. Because from that faith comes a force that no missile system can intercept, no intelligence agency can predict, and no government can silence. The strike may have lasted hours, but the echo it left behind reached the souls of those who had nearly given up hope, and gave them something they hadn't felt in years, a reason to believe again. 77 years after the birth of Israel, the world has witnessed a moment that will be remembered not just in military archives, but in the hearts of all who have lived under the shadow of injustice. One Iranian strike didn't just hit its target, it hit the illusion. The illusion that might makes right. The illusion that some lives matter more than others. Truth will rise, even through rubble. What was once hidden in the smoke of propaganda is now visible in the fire of reality. Gaza is no longer alone, and those who believe they could build peace upon the pain of others now stand face to face with the consequences of that choice. To every listener, thank you for walking with us through this powerful moment in history. May your eyes remain open, your heart remain just, and your voice never be silent in the face of oppression. The most powerful weapon in this world is a soul awakened by truth.